Hello, I'm Toycat and welcome back to the second channel geography video. This is everyone's favorite series where I talk about geography and the world and stuff. And today I want to talk about something which you've probably heard a whole bunch about if you've ever, looked up anything to do with countries, because it's mentioned a whole bunch, the idea of a country entirely surrounded by other countries, a landlocked state, or even worse, something which, is a really big implication for a state, and that's why there's so few of them, an enclave country where a country is entirely surrounded by one country. So in the case of an enclave country, here is San Marino, entirely surrounded by Italy. You can probably see why that's a problem, but if you look at, Czechia, which is entirely surrounded by Germany, Poland, Austria, and Slovakia, you might not think it's too big of a deal, and personally, I really didn't understand why it was a big deal, why it had to be like such a huge thing that a country was landlocked, but as you, read more into the geopolitics and stuff, it starts to make more sense, the implications make more sense, and I figured I could maybe share some of that with you in today's video and explain at least a little bit of why being landlocked is such a big deal, and why, therefore, there are so few landlocked countries in the world, because out of the 195 UN member states, there are roughly, more or less, there's only 49 countries which are landlocked in the entire world, which means roughly 1 in 4, and out of those, by the way, only 2 of those are outside of Africa, Asia, or Europe, so Afro-Eurasia, and they're both in South America. So yeah, it really just goes to show that most countries which are, being landlocked is a very hard thing to sustain as a country. Most of those countries appeared recently, and even then, there's such a tiny minority of the overall countries which are landlocked. So yeah, why is being landlocked such a big deal? And by the way, how can you spot a landlocked country, just so we know? Basically, you can spot a landlocked country because every one of their borders, every one of the ways out of the country is via another country. So Poland, for instance, can go through any of the countries around it, as well as right here into the Baltic Sea, as you can see. So they can go via the Baltic Sea, and then they can go through, like under the bridges here and stuff, and they can end up, anywhere else in the world. And the reason this is such a big deal, and oh, by the way, so that's how you know they're not landlocked, and landlocked means that they're trapped by on all sides by other countries. So traditionally, this has such a historical and such a big deal because this is a big deal for a country, because even today it's really important, a lot more important than you figure, or than I figured. Global shipping is still the primary way to get goods around the world. Unless it's a time-sensitive thing, you probably still send it by boat. It's the cheapest way to get something from one point in the world to another. So for trade, the sea is very important, and it's, historically was even more important, as well as being, the navy used to be the most important thing for a country, and therefore having access to the sea meant essentially your trade partners went from being just the ones around you to being any other country which also has access to the sea too. So if you are the Netherlands, for instance, via land, you can only hit Belgium and Germany. So, if you want to trade with either of those countries, it's fine. But if you go via the sea, you can trade with 100 and, what would it be like, 46 other countries. You can trade with 146 other countries directly by taking the sea route. So if you want to, Netherlands here can trade with Brazil if they want to. They can trade with Venezuela. I doubt they're doing too much of that, but you get the point. Basically, any country can trade with any other country, which is important. It also had like military implications. So military and trade are 2 pretty important things for a country, and therefore having access to the sea was really important, and most countries prioritize that to some extent, and most countries that didn't prioritize it, so again, this isn't a good example because it's a really recent state, but Czechia, for instance, if that was historically the case, if they wanted to trade with any other country that wasn't these 4, they'd have to go through their territory, they'd have to be on good terms, they'd have to on their conditions, and they'd have to hope that, the country is just a good guy, if Germany just takes your stuff and says, sorry, never reached Hamburg, don't know where it went, what are you going to do to Germany if you're Czechia? So my point being is you need to be on good terms with those states, and that causes strain for your diplomatic tensions, and it also means you have less access to the ability to trade because it's harder. Again, if you are in Czechia and you want to sell Czechian goods, you've got to go all the way to Hamburg. I believe they actually lease some ports in Hamburg, if I'm not mistaken, but they have to go all the way to Hamburg to trade internationally, which causes more issues than if you're just making something in Hamburg, sending it out to the world from there. Obviously, it's a lot faster, it's a lot better, and that is why almost every country in the world has access to the sea, because it's useful to receive goods, to send goods, and for military implications. And even though it's less so to this day, that's why you see more countries, it's still pretty darn important. And funnily enough, this is also why a lot of countries have their territorial goals that they did have or do have. So for instance, Russia, might notice they're always going on the expansion here and there. They took Crimea recently, and Crimea might just seem like it's a petty grab of like, Ukraine, you want to try and join the EU? Well, we'll take your little dangling peninsula over here. And but the truth is, it gives them their first like warm fleet port, warm port fleet, I should say. A warm fleet port doesn't make any sense, but basically they got a warm port fleet here, which means they can now have a year-round navy because Sevastopol and the Crimea island is now part of Russia, or it's now annexed by Russia. The international community doesn't recognize it, but they have a Russian base here, and that's really important for Russia. The reason Russia goes all the way awkwardly over here to Vladivostok is so they can have a Pacific fleet that's in warm water, because even though Russia is landlocked, it doesn't have true access to the sea because it's all frozen over here. It's all frozen over here, and they basically have a lot of weird territorial things. So this this is Russia right here, so they can have, you know, a warm water fleet. This is Russia, they kind of took that so they could have a warm water fleet. So this is from the old Germans during World War II. This is from, Ukraine very recently. And this is just over 100 years ago to the Russian Empire. They made territorial expansion a priority so they could do that trade, so they could have that military fleet. And it's important to have those things. And that's why lots of countries make, moves for this. That's why if you look at DR Congo over here, the Democratic Republic of Congo, you can see how they actually get, got this little bit of a strip of land from Angola, and they actually kind of just made it their own. As you can see, they've got this tiny little access to it right there, because it's just really, really, really important if you're a country like this to have access to the sea, or if you're a country anywhere in the world to have access to the sea, because it just makes all these things a lot easier, because you don't need another country's permission to go to the sea. So one of the things you'll notice, by the way, about even landlocked countries is landlocked countries aren't necessarily all landlocked. So first of all, let's mention that with the vast majority of European countries that are landlocked, so let's just go for an example here. The Danube River is the second longest river in Europe. It's the first longest in non-Russia Europe. Most European countries that are landlocked, or a lot of them, have capitals which go right into this river, which is an international waterway. It belongs to no one, anyone can use it, and it takes them right to the sea. So Vienna, it's on the Danube River, or the Danube, or however you want to pronounce it. Everyone pronounces it differently, and they hate everyone else's pronunciation, but anyway, it's on the Danube River. Vienna is on the Danube River. Then Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, on the Danube River. And then if we follow it down a little bit more, Budapest, also on the Danube River. Follow it down even more, and a fourth capital, Belgrade, is on the Danube River, as you can see just over here. So that's 4 capitals so far. Then it goes through Bulgaria a little bit, into Romania, and then also next to Bulgaria, it's like on their border, and then ends up into Ukraine. So it goes through 7 countries, and it means that a lot of those countries, admittedly only these 4 are landlocked, all have access to the sea, all have technical access, to trade and stuff, and that's pretty darn important. So yeah, that is why, fun fact, that the sea is really important, and even countries without access to the sea, having access to these rivers is so darn important. In fact, one of the reasons the US succeeded so much as a country, like the US, regardless of whether you like or hate the US, I feel like this is a controversial statement, but the US is the most successful country of all time at present. I mean, maybe China overtakes it one day, but the reason for that is because, look at it, has direct access to the sea from every angle. It's got a continent-wide access to the sea, but then also getting stuff around the country is easy because they have access to the Mississippi. I always forget the name of the river, but that was through the French territory, which they bought. But basically, that goes like up and down the fertile. Basically, they have river access for their country, as well as direct access to the sea here, to the ocean here, as well as direct access to the seas here to trade with Canada, I guess. I don't think it's too important, but still, it's another form of water access. Having access to water is really, 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 really darn important. So yeah, that is why being landlocked is such a big deal. That is why some of the 12 poorest countries, 9 of them are landlocked. Of the 49 landlocked countries in the world, most of them are pretty poor. Like there's Austria's doing well for itself, Switzerland doing really well for itself, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg. There's a bunch of countries which are doing well for themselves because of external factors. They've worked around the landlocked thing, but by default, a landlocked country is likely to be quite poor. Look at Ethiopia, for instance. You've heard something about Ethiopian crisis or famine or something like that, right? I'm sure you have. Think about all the stands, the republics which broke away from Russia. It's a very bad thing for a country to be landlocked, and as a result of that, and as a result of the fact that you wouldn't really, being landlocked is something that's, again, being independent and being landlocked is something that's only really been possible lately. Most landlocked countries were formed fairly recently. All of these formed in 1991 after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Serbia only became landlocked in 2006 after it lost, Montenegro. Was it 2006? I'm pretty sure it's 2006. But after they lost Montenegro, they became landlocked, and that creates a problem, but it's only recent, so it's not too big of a deal, and plus they're on friendly relations. But my point being is most countries which, think about Czechoslovakia, only dissolved in 1991. I'm not saying they were, next to the sea before that, but most of these countries are recent countries because existing, Belarus, all of these countries couldn't really exist as landlocked, all the African colonies, because it creates problems before that, and that is why Paraguay's had some of the most, horrendous military issues, and I think they had one of the worst military defeats ever. I hope I'm not getting mistaken, but still, my point being landlocked is bad. That's why countries really fight not to be landlocked, to have access to that sea. Even today, it's so valuable. It's going to be less valuable over time because we have a new ocean. It's the sky. So airports, Prague's airport is pretty darn big. I went there fairly recently. It's pretty big, as it turns out. And as airports become the new primary way, which will happen at some point, I don't know when. I have an uncle in logistics, and I was like, so when is that going to happen? Try to get the inside scoop because he does some crazy stuff for the big biggest supply chain in the world, and he's like, probably not anytime soon. Boats are pretty darn easy because the water's just everywhere, whereas a plane, you have to push it through the sky. So at some point, being landlocked will just not be a thing, really. But for now, being landlocked is still a big deal. And also, there are 2 countries in the world that are double landlocked. I go through this every time I mention it, but Liechtenstein is double landlocked, but it's a really special exception because, like, it's a tiny, it's basically a town-sized country. And then, Uzbekistan, if I'm not mistaken, is also double landlocked, so you have to go through 2 sets of countries to get to the sea. And yeah, again, this was founded just after the end of the Holy Roman Empire, like only 130 years ago, and it's Liechtenstein, so it's an exception. And Uzbekistan is a country which has real problems, like you can imagine looking at this that they have problems, and because being double landlocked is just not a good thing. Fun fact for a country. So anyway, I said I'd also talk about enclave countries a bit, so let's do that too. So yeah, that's countries surrounded entirely by another country, but let's talk about countries surrounded entirely by another country that's all the same country, because there's only 3 examples of this in the world, because it's an equally problematic situation. There is San Marino and there is Vatican City, both in Italy. Poor Italy has 2 countries like trapped within it. I guess poor countries within inside Italy. And then, because the Vatican City is like one of these like barely a countries, but it's technically in the UN, so we say it's a country, so sure, do that, whatever. And then the final example is Lesotho. So Lesotho is perhaps the more interesting of the 3, but let's talk a little bit about Italy's ones first. San Marino, because it is entirely surrounded by Italy, their foreign policy, although it's independent, actually, let's talk about how these things came to be, because this is a fairly modern thing. You cannot exist as a country enclave for very long, because you probably would be swallowed up. Like, if that existed in the middle of Germany, would have been swallowed up. Existed in the middle of England, would have been swallowed up. So how did San Marino and how did Vatican City not end up as just part of Italy with special statuses? Because in America, there's a whole bunch of countries that would be countries, but they're absorbed by the US. They're all the, what are they called? Reservations for Native Americans. So, this is technically a country, but it has no country designation anywhere in the world, because there's a billion of these around America. But still, my point being is most countries absorb them. The US absorbed them. Why did Italy not? So Italy only reunified towards the end of the 19th century, so less than 150 years ago now was when it was complete. Italy used to just be a bunch of city-states and mini-states, and basically, again, you're probably familiar with the idea of the city-state. Mostly existed in Italy, and existed in Italy for a very long time. And basically, yeah, these states only reunified towards the end of the 19th century, and because unification was such a controversial thing, it's kind of like the whole thing in America of like, federal versus local level or whatever. Like it's a big problem of like the federal government can't do this or that. That happened in Italy, and because San Marino, even though they opposed reunification, they helped to harbor people who were making unification happen. Did I say reunification? I mean unification for the first time. And because they harbored people from reunification, whenever, when they finally got to Rome and they made the country a thing, they're like, San Marino, you did some cool stuff. You get to be a country. I wish I was making that up, but that's really how it is. Like, they're just like, you helped us become a country. Stay your own independent thing. However, because San Marino is entirely surrounded by Italy, they're a pretty small country, but they're really rich. They have more cars than people. Because they are, surrounded by Italy, they have to just do whatever Italy says. So they're in the Italy customs area. They're in the Italy immigration area. They use the euro. They even have their own special euros. They're favored by collectors. They're never used there. Basically, living in San Marino is just living in Italy, but it's a separate, officially, it is a separate, sovereign state. It has its own sovereign abilities, but realistically, it's always, it'd be very easy for Italy just to be like, oop, and it's done. And that is why, to some extent, being a country surrounded by another country is not true independence. It's, again, their only path to the sea is via Italy, their trade, their everything is done via Italy, and it works and it functions today because it doesn't matter too much. But again, if it ever became an issue, then that's how it happened. However, the Vatican City is one that would never become an issue because the Vatican City is the smallest country in the world. It's just the way this became about, because unlike San Marino, where they were just granted it straight away, when Italy reunified, they reunified all the different parts of Italy, turned it into one big country. However, the Vatican refused because, again, until that point, they'd maintained some some weird powers in political stuff. So they just took their own little corner of the city. They built walls around it, or they had walls before, and they stayed in that little corner of the city, and just said, we're not coming out, and we don't respect your authority. And for 50 years, they just said, fine. Then, you know, we're not going to fight with the Pope. So they just, like, left it its own thing. They said it was part of Italy, and the Pope said, nope, it's its own little thing. And then when Mussolini came to power in the World War II, to everyone's favourite days of Italy, right? But no, when that happened, you know, they granted it just be its own independent country, just so they would, like, stop and so they could, like, get some concessions. And even when the Nazis came and occupied Rome for a little bit, they left the Vatican alone and said, you know, you want to be neutral? Sure. And even, yeah, it's kind of cool that, like, even the Nazis wouldn't take over the Pope and do that kind of thing. And to this day, they just kind of give it, like, independence, and it's used as, like, a tax loophole in some cases, you could argue. A lot of people say, like, oh, it's the world's smallest tax loophole or something like that. But yeah, it is something that exists entirely surrounded by Italy, but they have no, you know, like, foreign relations in terms of, like, you know, they don't have a military because it's the Pope. They don't have, like, real territory. It's just, like, a little place that is technically its own country, and that's how that exists. So that means there's only one true example. I mean, there's two examples. I don't know why, but a part of me doesn't like calling the Vatican City a country, because I mean, like, look at it. But anyway, let's talk about Lesotho, because every time Lesotho's come up before, I've had no idea about Lesotho. I'll be honest with you, there's 195 countries in the world. I'd like to say I know a little bit about everyone, but I had no idea about Lesotho. Like, the only fun fact I could say is that, like, I guess it's surrounded by South Africa. You know, it's enclaved by South Africa. That is the only thing I knew about it, and, you know, that's me being ignorant, so I figured I'd look into it a bit. And the long story short of what I found, my understanding is that Lesotho is not a part of South... so, for the record, you can say Lesotho is in South Africa, in the sense of it's in the south of Africa, but it's not a part of South Africa. It's its own independent thing. However, it's a really troubled independent thing, so, again, it's much smaller than South Africa. South Africa has a population approaching 60 million, almost on par with the UK. Lesotho's population is more like 2 million, so it's a very small population, and it's a very small country, and it's also a country which has a really, really heavily... non-urban population. I don't know the word. It's rural, that's the one. It has a really rural population, and because of the really rural population and the low population, they're not necessarily so significant on the world stage, and they're actually quite closely related to the South Africa that's around it. So how did it come to be enclaves? So back in the day when, you know, like, Africa was just like a bunch of Europe's colonies, right? You know, the good old days to some, I'm sure. But when that was the case, you know, there was a bunch of different colonies, and one of them was Lesotho. It had a different name at the time, but when all of the countries came to reunify to make South Africa, you know, there's a bunch of different ones, as you can see right here. This is a map from the time. What was at the time Basotho land decided, you know what, nah, we don't want to be part of that. And even though Orange Free State and Natal, all of these places came together and they formed South Africa as a unitary state, which caused a whole bunch of issues, but again, I've addressed that before. When all of these places formed, you know, to make South Africa, it would be really smart. Like, most countries would not refuse joining a union like that, fearing the pressure, but Lesotho was like, you know, we'll stick to our independence and we'll do it that way. And they eventually, you know, they remained under British control because they weren't independent. They were like, no, wait, they weren't independent, they were independent. They remained under British control until about 1966, and then after that, they just kind of, like, kept the status quo. South Africa didn't care enough to, like, or didn't want to invade them, and they didn't invade themselves. And Lesotho has so many problems that I guess it really doesn't benefit, it benefits both sides to be separate. Lesotho, if you don't know, has one of the highest AIDS propagation rates in the world. 1 in every 4 adults there is a... 1 in every 4 adults in Lesotho has HIV/AIDS. Again, the distinction's confusing, but, you know, that 1 in every 4 adults has it. The, you know, like, the mortality rate is, like, depressingly high. Like I said, the average income there is depressingly low. It's a very troubled country for a whole bunch of reasons, and I guess because of that, like, comparatively to South Africa, even though South Africa has its whole own set of problems too, you know, Africa has a lot of problems, as it turns out. Lesotho has a whole even more wide range of problems, and yeah, because of that, Lesotho, independent country. South Africa doesn't really want to take it over. Lesotho doesn't really want to join South Africa because, again, separate tribes and stuff like that. And because of that, Lesotho exists in the way it does to this day. Lesotho, if you don't know, by the way, it's like, again, it's like African but influenced by the British. In fact, all of South Africa, just for a fun lesson before we go, because I've never mentioned this, South Africa is essentially white Africa, but it's not actually white. Like, there's a minority of people there, 10%, who are white, which is more than you'll find anywhere else in Africa, and they ruled for a bit, but that's how the apartheid thing came about. And the reason they were white is because it came from British colonies, where, like, British people actually went, although most of the people there derived from the Dutch, which is why there's a language spoken there, Afrikaans, and you might be like, oh no, Afrikaans, I can't understand that, but it's really closely derived from Dutch. So if you're an English speaker, you can learn Afrikaans really easy, and you can speak to South Africans. Although, I like South Africans' accents, so I'm just saying, you should listen to that in English, maybe, or whatever. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. So that is landlocked countries, countries surrounded by other countries. That is enclave countries, countries entirely surrounded by one country. And there's technically like an in-between like state of like countries surrounded by just two countries, because they have almost the same problems, but like, again, for the most part, it's a little bit easier. Like Liechtenstein, surrounded by only two countries. Both countries are pretty friendly though. You know, Andorra, surrounded by two countries. Both countries pretty friendly about it though, and there's a few other examples like that in the world. But my point, my point being is that having access to the sea, having access to other countries for trade and for war and just for fun is important. And hopefully, I explained the magnitude of that in today's video. So yeah, thank you very much for watching today's video. Oh, by the way, I never mentioned because. Having access to the sea is so important. Luanda, which has like really access to the sea because its port's congested and stuff like that, is the most expensive city to live in on Earth. And you might be like, how does that even make sense? How is Angola the most expensive country? But it really is. So just because I found it fun, here is the cost of living in Angola, in Luanda, Angola. So again, we're talking like a city where the average income is something like $2 a day. This is how much it costs to buy things. So an inexpensive restaurant costs $19. An expensive restaurant, oh, now that's mid-range, $90. A mook meal at McDonald's is $16. Basically, things are pretty darn expensive. If you want to buy some apples, it's $9 for a kilo. I'm pretty sure that's expensive. And basically, everything is pretty crazy expensive besides stuff that is expensive country, expensive city, even though people don't make much there. If you want to buy a 3-bedroom apartment outside the city center, it's $6,250. It's really expensive, and I didn't believe it at first, but it's because they have really terrible access within the country and terrible access to the sea because their port is so congested and it's so far away, and they've got import like regulations and stuff like that. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Second channel, don't care. Goodbye.